a pleasure to start today a landmark, a very important moment for the Brazil-Africa Institute, which is the open lecture of the IBRAF Fellowship Program. When we started to think about this initiative, Ambassador Amorim, the idea was to bring to the table experts and researchers from many areas to bring a special attention for South-South and triangular cooperation, look into the possibility of interaction between Brazil, Africa, but also from other regions. And I remember very clear in 2003 when President Lula said that Africa should be a priority for his government. I kept this in my mind, and I know that you are behind this statement because Africa is in your heart and Africa is in your agenda. That's why I'm very pleased to start today at the Brazil-Africa Institute this initiative, which is the IBRAF Fellowship Program. We know that Brazil and Africa are connected. Although we are facing a very difficult moment now when the world is isolated, we cannot forget that Africa is the place that Brazil should look very precisely. And we can learn from each other. Usually people say that Brazil can teach to Africa. Yes, we can transfer some knowledge, but also I can see very clear that we can learn as well from the African perspective. And today I'm very pleased to have the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Minister of Defense of Brazil, Ambassador Celso Amorim, to start this very important moment for us. The IBRAF Fellowship Program, which is starting now, had 340 applications, Ambassador Amorim, and we have now 9 participants. And I know that they are very excited to hear from you, from your perspective, your ideas, your thoughts, and I know that after this moment, they will be able to start officially the program during the next 6 months. So, without delay, I'll pass the floor to you, Ambassador Amorim. You are very welcome, and I'm very pleased as well to inform that Ambassador Amorim is a member of our advisory board, and I'm learning, and the Institute is learning too much every time when we have Ambassador Amorim with us. And I know that this is going to happen today again. Ambassador Amorim, please.
Well, thank you, João. Thank Carolina. It's a pleasure, of course. It would be, of course, probably nicer if we could be in presence with each other, but in any way, it is a pleasure. Probably it would be difficult to have people from so many parts of the world. So there are also these positive sides, if we can try to look at them in this difficult moment that we are living, of course. No, it is a pleasure, of course. I'm also very pleased to see so many young ladies from different parts of the world and one young gentleman from Porto Alegre in Brazil, apart from you, of course. You're a very young gentleman as well. I'm the only senior here, so to use an euphemistic word. But anyway, it is a pleasure. Although I must say that although I had spent some time in university, also I'm not a theoretician. I've been a practitioner, and I feel when I talk about South-South cooperation, a little bit like a character of a play by the famous French playwright Molière, Monsieur Jourdain. Monsieur Jourdain, some of you might know, some of you might not know, so I'll just mention Monsieur Jourdain in the 17th century was a bourgeois, but he would like to become a gentleman, a really gentleman, a member of the aristocracy. So he takes classes. He takes classes on music, he takes classes on philosophy, he takes classes on literature. And especially on literature, the teachers tell him the difference between poetry and prose. And well, after learning the definition of both, Monsieur Jourdain said, he said in French, in which there is a rhyme. I will not mention that, but let me go into English. Oh, what a beautiful thing. I speak in prose. So he didn't know he spoke in prose. So I must say that in a way, I've been as an ambassador, foreign minister, and also Minister of Defense. And I learned that in all these posts, I have been practicing South-South cooperation. I mean, it's not that I defined previously that I had to have South-South cooperation, but that was, of course, I knew something about it. I know, of course, I had my experience in the UN and also as a younger uh, official in the Brazilian government. I accompanied, I was not present, but at the Buenos Aires conference about the TCDC, Technical Cooperation Among Developing Countries. And I participated in some initiatives. In some I was involved from the beginning, and in others I just was a participant. I'm speaking still as a more junior diplomat, like in the G15, which was also created with this objective of being, let us say, a kind of counterpoint to the G7, which it was never the case, but also was an important forum to develop South-South cooperation. And maybe it was in the G15, although not many projects really, I believe. I don't know how many. I mean, I've never made a calculation on that, but it was in the G15 that we somehow were more awakened to the potentialities of the South-South cooperation and how it and the difficulties as well. I mean, how to do it with countries of different cultures, with different backgrounds, and so on. But of course, we learned also the potential of that. And so I had this kind of experience before, and I would like just to say very briefly about how Brazil sees it, and I'll not dwell so much on the specificities of the projects, although I'll be very happy to talk about some of them if you wish, even triangular cooperation, because when we speak about triangular cooperation, João, you normally think about triangular involving a developed country or an international organization, and it may be so, but not necessarily. For instance, Brazil, India, and South Africa were very much involved in cooperation in Haiti. So this was a kind of, not triangular really, because it was quadrangular cooperation involving developing countries, three of them more on the giving side and one more on the receiving side. But I think when, excuse me if I'm not speaking in a very organized way, but I'm motivated by things that I heard already in this brief statement by João, and by the presence, motivated by the presence of so many young people from different parts of the world. João mentioned a very important thing. I don't remember his exact words, but I have been reading recently about Paulo Freire, a very famous Brazilian educator, very well known in very many parts of the world, including Argentina. He was in Africa. He was all over the world. He was for some time linked also with the World Council of Churches. He's a very broad-minded man, and will be. He died already, and we'll be celebrating his centenary. And I was reading about him and from him, and one very important thing that he says on education. He says several things, of course, about education. I don't want to go on that very deeply because it would take too much time. But one important thing that he says that education is always how should I say, an exercise in two directions. It's not as if someone is giving and on the other side is receiving. That's not like that. It's always a dialogue. He uses the word dialogical movement between the giver and the receiver, so that really the receiver is also receiving all the time, and the receiver is also giving. And I think this conception is very important because this implies, and this is very important for cooperation because it implies understanding the other side. It's not, and I think this probably is one, I'm moving on to conceptual things, but anyway, maybe this is one of the strongest aspects of the South-South cooperation because countries in the South, talk about Brazil, but could be another one, are in a better position to understand the needs of the other. So it's in a better position to dialogue and not to impose. And I think this is probably the biggest difference between the South-South cooperation, which of course a very broad concept, and I'll mention some aspects of it, and it involves broad array of countries, of course, from countries which are nowadays big economic powers like China to countries that are proud and poor, but poor, like Burkina Faso. Of course, I mean, I mentioned that because I've been there, and one of my first friends outside the Brazil was when I went to the diplomatic academy in Vienna. That's almost 60 years ago, almost, not just, and not quite, but anyway. And one of my good friends was from the Haute Volta, as it was called at the time, La Haute Volta, and a very good friend, Mr. Caboret, who then later on became an important, or Caboret, he became an important ambassador to the UN and so on and so forth. But anyway, so we all learn from each other, and I mentioned this my experience in the diplomatic academy in Vienna. And when people asked me, with all due respect to my Austrian host, what did I learn more? It was with my friends from different parts of the world, including, of course, very much so, my friends from Africa. I'm already going into the essence of or some aspect at least of the technical cooperation between developing countries. But maybe what I would like to speak a little more in relation to the Brazilian policy is let us say, what I might call the geopolitics of South-South cooperation, because it doesn't happen in a political void. It's not as if, of course, it can link countries with different experiences, with different ideologies, and we always were very, very, very respectful of these differences with the different countries we cooperated. But of course, there is also a geopolitical element which is involved, and I'll come back to that as I move along. But just to retain this idea that we're not dealing with something that is just a technical decision, but it is a political decision. To go south is not a technical decision; it's a political decision. In our, probably in English you won't get that, or in French, but in Spanish, I think it is. Even our vocabulary is influenced by the north-south, the north being the rich, the south on the receiving side. They are on top, we are on the bottom. We even use the word in Portuguese, I believe also in Spanish, nortear. Nortear is to orient oneself, to go to the north. Go look at the polar star, at the star of the north, when we could very well look at the star of the south cross that we know so well here in Brazil and Argentina. But anyway, and in other parts of Africa. But so it's a political decision, and I think just making how Brazil went into that, it would be very long. Of course, as other developing countries, even though we were formally independent 200 years ago, it will be 200 years exactly next year. But we lived isolated. Our relation was with Europe, even in relation to the other countries in South America. We were not really very much, except maybe a little bit in the River Plate Basin with Argentina. Not always the relationship being very good, because there were rivalries were stimulated and encouraged by the ruling elites in each country. But anyway, these things changed. And I'll just mention very quickly the first steps that I think that Brazil made in going south. The first more clear step, of course, I would have to be very honest, even during the military dictatorship, Brazil is, unlike many other countries actually, in some aspects had already started some South-South cooperation. For instance, a very important action during the government of a general president, was Geisel, was the recognition of the MPLA as the government of Angola in 1975. The MPLA was self-declared as Marxist-Leninist, or at least Marxist. And we were in the Cold War, and Brazil was a right-wing government ruled by right-wing military men. And I say men because it was actually men. There was no women involved. But on the other hand, let us say, Africa as a destiny was very clear for us, very clear. I mean, this has to do with our history. Of course, it's not a very nice history. Of course, there's slavery and so on. But of course, in any way, there was also this notion of proximity. And I just mentioned to you, I mean, now I'm speaking a bit more about Brazil. One aspect, if I go from one capital of the Northeast of Brazil to Dakar, for instance, or to Cape Verde, I have done that in a small plane without a toilet. So it was a really adventure. So it's about 4 hours 4 hours flight. It's less time than going from the same capital to the to the westernmost capital or westernmost city in Brazil, Cruzeiro do Sul in Acre. So you see how close we are to Africa in many respects, even in a physical way, not to speak about our culture and so on. So there was always in Brazil an interest. So I would say that the first steps that geopolitically we took, not only one, let us say, topic thing, geopolitically in going south was a two-pronged thing. It was not thought that way, but it happened that way. In South America, especially the relations with Argentina, I don't want to go deep into that, but I just want to mention one or two points which are very crucial. I'll come back, and to Africa. With Argentina, it was very important because there was a historic rivalry that was, as I said, stimulated not only by the elite, but especially by the military, because they somehow uh, nourished their own projects, uh, military projects, and so on. And the cooperation with Argentina was absolutely fundamental for us and for Argentina, I believe, especially in one field, which was the nuclear field. That the South Africans will understand that, certainly because South Africa was a country also that was considered a threshold country in terms of nuclear power. And Brazil and Argentina decided to have, to simplify things, mutual inspections in the area of the nuclear. And this was really something revolutionary in terms of getting close and putting aside all the misgivings that might exist between the two countries. But of course, we developed also cooperation, biotechnology, and so on. In other aspects of our beginnings of our sudden, when I say beginnings, doesn't mean that nothing happened before, but I mean when it started to take shape in relation to Africa, it was really motivated to a large extent by cultural factors, and it had to do more with the Portuguese-speaking countries. So, I mean, to mention one fact, in 1989, we had the first meeting of leaders of the Portuguese-speaking countries, included, of course, Portugal as well, but included 5 African countries at the time. East Timor-Leste was not yet independent, and Brazil. So that was an important thing that somehow reawakened our feelings for Africa and somehow helped us in rediscovering. I was at the time involved in the cultural field, and I remember the first festivals of Brazilian film in Guinea-Bissau and in Mozambique. Certainly in Guinea-Bissau, it was probably the first important international cultural event to take place in Bissau. That was 77, I believe. So this is just to explain a little bit the history of and how we got nearer and nearer. And Rene, who is from South Africa, right? Yes. And I had the great honor in 94 to be the Brazilian representative at the inauguration of President Mandela. So this is probably one of the highest points in my CV. And I was able to deliver a letter by the Brazil's president, Itamar Franco, to President Mandela personally, in a gesture in which I was helped actually by an Argentinian diplomat who took the only picture of that moment. Anyway, well, so I'm saying this to show how interested we were, and since I see someone from Egypt also, Tariha, and I believe I remember that we discussed projects with Egypt within the G15. I was not a minister then, but I followed the part, and I remember there was an interest. I don't remember exactly if it was rice production or something like that, but there was something that we discussed specifically with Egypt. So we started to broaden our interest in the south. And to mention another aspect, very different, because all these somehow is part of the same complex architecture. You know, South-South cooperation is like these European cathedrals that you say, well, what is it? Is it Gothic? Is it Romantic? Or is it Baroque? Or is it Renaissance? It's a bit of everything. So South-South cooperation is also a bit of everything. And to mention a very different aspect of this cooperation was our cooperation with China. Brazil, historically, had not recognized the People's Republic of China, but when the United States started its conversations with China back in 74, the Brazilian government, 73, 74, the Brazilian government, then, again, it's still in the military government, decided that we should not wait and immediately recognized Beijing as the People's Republic as the one China. And already in the democratic period, about 10 or 12 years later, we established the first very important, at the time I was working in the Ministry of Science and Technology, and I can tell you, it was probably, I was involved, for instance, in the discussion of biotechnology schools and informatics schools with Argentina, but that was probably the first big S&T, R&D, if you wish, project between developing countries. At the time, China was not today's China, so it was very much seen as a developing country, although already somewhat advanced in the military field. And we had a joint program for a satellite of what we call Earth monitoring or remote sensing. I mean, it's very technical, but anyway, it was very important because it's not like cooperating in a very small thing. Because normally people think, well, South-South is just to see how you do with the sewage and so on, which of course is very important. But it's not only that; it may be also in the area of high technology. And for a long time, I believe that was the biggest South-South cooperation project among between developing countries. And it continues. This project continues. We actually later on we even had a program for Africa together with the Chinese. I remember specifically discussions in Mozambique, so that they could receive for free the images that this satellite produced. So it's interesting to see how all these things somehow interrelate. But as I said, these were still topical things. We could not say that Brazil had really embarked on a South-South cooperation policy. It was topic. Here, Argentina was, of course, a political motivation, consolidating democracy in the two countries. With Africa, they had this cultural, a little bit sentimental aspect that was involved. Of course, it's maybe some idea in the back of the minds of the economic gains, but this is never totally separated, I must say. But it was motivated. And China was really a strategic thing at that time. This was, I believe, 86 that we started this negotiation. 88, the agreement was signed. This was somehow even a gesture of some, how should I say, audacity, because it was still the Cold War, and Brazil being seen as the country in the Western camp somehow, although we were not part of any Western alliance. But anyway, this was something very new, important. I mean, I mentioned these three things. I could mention others, of course, and I don't want to bother you with much detail. But I would like to say one thing that I think is important, one or two things about the multilateral field. We had one limitation in our South-South cooperation because Brazil was never a member of the non-aligned movement for ideological reasons, mainly because when the non-aligned movement evolved in the 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s, Brazil was under this right-wing military dictatorship, and we didn't become a member of we became an observer. And we are still observers. And I can belabor on that if you're interested. But anyway, in a way, that was a limitation, I believe, in the United Nations. Not an absolute limitation, because on the other hand, Brazil was a founding member and a very active, and I would say without any arrogance, one of the leaders of the G77, which helped to do more with the economic side. It was created, as you know, during the first United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, inspired to a large extent by our great Argentinian master Raul Prebisch, but Brazil was very much involved in that and played an important role and continued to play an important role even during the military government, because there was an interesting dichotomy. In the political field, Brazil, during the military government, to some extent, got nearer to the West, at least in the first years, but always with some dose of indiscipline, some modicum of indiscipline, fortunately. But in the economic field, we are very close to the other developing countries. And again, I could mention, for instance, although we as a diplomat, I can't say that, I was a young diplomat then, I was in my 20s and 30s, we were barred from having communication with the Cuban diplomat, in theory, because of the ideological aversion that the military had for the Cuban regime. But in spite of that, for instance, I can remember one particular instance because I was involved, but there were tens and probably hundreds of other examples. One example I mentioned was a conference on science and technology for South America that took place in Ecuador, in Quito, and Brazil coordinated its position mainly with Cuba, because we were the two countries that were more, at the time, interested in developing homegrown technology, so to say, to put in a very simple way. So anyway, this was a limitation. But I would say also in other aspects, for instance, in WTO, Brazil was, I'm speaking of now already the period of the democratic government after 85, very much involved in the negotiations, for instance, of the Uruguay round and later on. And sorry to be too much personal in these things, but it's the easiest thing because of the things that I know that I have seen personally. But you can just imagine this happening with some other actor as well. But a very important moment of this South-South cooperation, and I think a very important moment of that showed the confidence between Brazil, in this case, and Africa, was in the launching of the Doha round of trade negotiations, also known as Doha Development Round, which unfortunately never came to conclusion. But anyway, there was a very important thing. If you are, of course, a student, I imagine, of international relations practitioners, if you still look at decisions now in the pandemics of the World Health Organization, if you look, for instance, at the Agenda 2030, the Agenda on Sustainable Development, you'll see what I'm going to mention now, or also refer to there, which is the Doha Declaration on Trips and Health. This was a milestone in allowing the developing countries to break the pattern, so to say, in order to have access to medicine. At the time, our main preoccupation, of course, was HIV/AIDS, but it is generally, and it's for any kind of medicine. And this was a very important moment because it tried to explore. It's still very difficult to do that, I know, because there are many ways that the pharmaceutical companies can avoid that, but it's still a very important and often quoted resolution. As I said, it is there in the objective number 3 of the goal number 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is on health. It goes on and on saying about what the goal should be, and say respecting the flexibilities established by the Doha Declaration on Trips and Health. So these are very important. Well, why I mentioned that? Because that was something in which we were all involved, developing countries. Argentina was a very active, in spite of the neoliberal politics that they had at the time. I think it was Menem, still Menem, and no, it was no longer Menem, but anyway, it was and Argentina and also other countries, but not yet the Kirchner government, anyway. But we are all involved in that, and the Africans. And the most touching thing that I had was, you know how these negotiations go on in international organizations. You start with a big group, I mean, with all membership. In the case of WTO, then it would be 150 or so, or 160. But then you go to smaller groups, you go to a group of 70 or 60, and then you go to a group of 20, and then you go to a group of 10 in order to solve the question. And at a certain point, the chairman of the group, who was a Mexican, said, now I just want Brazil and the United States, because we were, let's say, representing the two poles of the discussion. One, of course, in favor of developing countries, the other, of course, favoring the pharmaceutical companies and the developed world. And I said at that time, I was the ambassador, I was not minister, I was ambassador in Geneva then, in charge of the trade. And I said, but I will not go into the room without an African, because I know there was a subtle nuance between our, not a contradiction, but we put an emphasis in one aspect and the Africans put an emphasis on the different aspect. I don't want to go into the details now, but anyway, the Africans were more interested in a possibility of importing. In the case of Brazil, we were more interested in the possibility of producing locally. But the general thing was not different. And I said, but I don't want to go into a room without an African. And there was a minister from Cameroon that, for some reason, he was coordinating the African position. Said, no, if Brazil goes in, Africa feels represented. Oh, I felt very pleased with that, because really that was probably one of the best moments I had in my career as a diplomat. And I'm just mentioning that to show that our cooperation was very intense, especially in economic matters in the multilateral forum. But all that was done with maybe some oscillation in Brazil, because at the same time that this was happening, Brazil was having a government that was more, let us say, in economic terms, more neoliberal, with some limitations. But it was a democratic government, Henrique Cardoso, but it was very interested in privatization and having very good relations with the financial centers of the world. But it had an interesting and positive policy on health, which permitted me to do that. But there were oscillations. So it was not very clear that we could really involve, and I'm just omitting many aspects which are interesting, but I'm omitting very many aspects. But so our position was not, let us say, all the time in this direction. There was some oscillation. And I believe, without being, I mean, of course, you know, I've been minister for President Lula, I had been minister before for Itamar Franco for 1.5 years, and I became foreign minister with President Lula, and I stayed with him the full 8 years, the two. I was actually the only minister with a real portfolio. There were two ministers we are called house ministers, to some extent, that also stayed the full terms. But I was the only minister with a portfolio that stayed the two full terms, which is interesting because I was not a member of the Workers' Party before. So he picked me up from the state bureaucracy. Anyway, but Lula had a vision, and it's very interesting that, you know, if we go to his inaugural speech in 2003, then you see a clear decision to go with the developing countries. He mentioned very specifically Africa, Latin America, of course, Latin America integration, so on. He mentioned very specifically Africa, and he mentions the big developing countries. By no coincidence, I would say the countries he mentions are precisely the countries that are now members of the BRICS, which is an interesting thing. He was not referring to the BRICS, which was a concept had already been used by this economist of Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill, who later on became minister in the UK, but he referred precisely to that. And in his first actions, my first actions as foreign minister, we took many decisions that had to do, and I'll very briefly summarize them because they are so broad and so ample. One of my first trips, Latin America, not to speak, because that was very important, consolidating Mercosur, enlarging it to the whole of South America to the extent possible, which later on became UNASUR. Now it's a different, I'm always speaking about an ideal Brazil, not the real Brazil of nowadays, please. But this Brazil is our Brazil that existed in the past, and I'm very confident will exist again in the future. In the present, we are a kind of stray sheep in the developing world. I mean, but that's just a parenthesis. So I'm speaking about the Brazilian I knew and the Brazilian that I hope will come back to be. For the young people, I'm sure they will act in that direction. So one of my first trips was to Africa, and I could see the interest, and I went to several countries. I don't want to go, of course, some of the Portuguese-speaking countries, but also went to Namibia, also went to Zimbabwe, which was at the time very much isolated, South Africa, of course, but Zimbabwe, which was very much isolated by the former colonial power. That's the truth of it. And we had very good relations with them. Of course, that didn't go into the merits of their government. We tried to be not to interfere. When people asked us, we tried to help, as it happened here in Latin America, in Venezuela, and some other cases. But otherwise, we would not interfere. But we had this plural attitude, and I came back with this notion that Africa had some thirst about Brazil. It was thirsty, I said. There is because somehow we were a kind of elder brother. I mean, we have gone with all our problems. I don't want to belittle our problems. Brazil is a country in which there is still very much racial discrimination. We improved a lot during the Lula government with affirmative actions and many other things, but far from being not perfect, nothing is perfect, but far from being reasonable still. But anyway, this is being changed. Now there has been an interruption, which I hope will be a short-term interruption, and but which again doesn't prevent the cooperation at other levels of social organization, as João Bosco knows better than anyone else. But anyway, so one of the first actions, going to Africa, being there, stimulating. Then soon after that, Lula proposed the establishing of a summit between Arab countries and South American countries, ASPA, it was called. I went innumerable times to Egypt, for instance, to Cairo, to discuss with my friends, foreign ministers, and of course also with the Secretary General of the Arab League. And this was really when Amra Musa was, who was very close, to whom I had been very close because he was minister before, I had been minister before, I was ambassador to the UN, he was ambassador to the UN, not exactly in the same period, but anyway. And then, of course, I became foreign minister at the time that he was the Secretary General of the Arab League. And we had the first meeting, which was, of course, of great importance. It actually came about in 2005 between developing countries. And just to show to you how difficult it is, how geopolitical it is to have South-South cooperation in a broader way, which is not only, let us say, one specific project. I'm not belittling the importance of a specific project, but I mean, if you want a broader cooperation, political exchanges, commercial exchanges, maybe agreements, commercial agreements, anyway, it's more difficult. When we had this first meeting of ASPA, then the second one was in Qatar, the third one in Lima. I don't know how it is now because these things require a lot of political will, I must say, because it's not running, it's not the direction of the market. The direction of the market is for us to have relations with the United States, with Europe, for Africa to have the relations with Europe, and so on. So it has to, requires some very powerful political will to change the current. And well, we did that. And we had this first meeting of ASPA in Brazil. And at the time, I received a call by the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, asking if the United States could be observer in the meeting. And I said, well, okay, the meeting will be live on TV. You can put your TV on and observe, but not participate in something that's South America and the Arab world. And we had this meeting, which was very successful. We later on even create a kind of virtual library and things like that. I don't want to go into the trade increased very much. I can't speak about Brazil, but I believe it's also increased for other South American countries. So that was, and I discovered something interesting, is how present, well, I knew that theoretically, but I could see more exactly because how present the Arab influence is, how present it is in all our countries. No, that's just a parenthesis. But later on, in 1 hour visit to Nigeria, Marie-Louise is from Nigeria, isn't she? It was President Obasanjo. Lula was with Obasanjo, and Obasanjo proposed to us to have, well, they had already, I believe, something like India and African countries, or China and Africa, why don't we have a summit between Brazil, he said Brazil and African countries. But we were very keen on the integration of South America, and we were very keen in giving an international personality also for South America. And then we counter-proposed to have a meeting between African countries, and South America. And that took place also. The first meeting was in Abuja, and then I think there was a meeting in somewhere else. I don't know. I lost track of what happened. But again, these are things that demand a lot of interest. I'll mention two other things, and then I'll go, maybe if I have time, to some specifics, because otherwise they will say, well, this guy only spoke about generalities. I mean, we don't know exactly what happened. But let me say two more things which I think are important. We hear a lot about BRICS. We don't hear a lot about IBSA. But IBSA was a group formed by India, Brazil, South Africa, which was born, the idea was born in a conversation between the Minister of South Africa, Nkosazana Zuma, and myself, and the first day of Lula's government. Not the very first day, because the first day is ceremonial, but the second day, she stayed there one day more. We had a bilateral talk, and again, abbreviating it, say, well, let us make something that will work. 3 developing countries, one in each part in each continent, multicultural. At the time, I said also democratic, and so on and so forth. So we created IBSA. And why do I mention IBSA? IBSA had its own importance. It had projects, as I said, in Haiti, in Guinea-Bissau. It had projects on Burundi. It had projects, I believe, in Nepal and several parts of the world, of the 3 countries. We think that, and actually the project, now I'm becoming concrete, you see, the project that we had in Haiti received a prize by the UNDP as an example of technical cooperation between developing countries. Just for you to know, Haiti is, of course, most of you know, but Haiti is a very African country in South America, of course, mostly African, 90% African descendants, and it's the poorest country in South America. It suffered enormous discrimination, and it was the first real revolution in Latin America. It was the Haiti, but I don't want to go into the history. But it's a country that suffers very much from many things, political interventions, but also natural disasters. And in the middle of the first decade, with the IBSA, we created a project that had to do with the collection of solid waste. And this was an interesting project because waste in the streets is a big problem. Garbage in the streets is a problem in Haiti. On the other side, it gave employment to many people because someone had to collect the garbage. And still, the result was used, maybe with limited success, but it was used as a kind of fuel, or at least home fuel. And that again was a great problem because in Haiti, almost all the forest had been destroyed because it's very poor on mineral fuels, and it has used a lot of wood as timber, as I mentioned. This is an example. I could mention other examples for the other countries, as I mentioned, Bissau, etc., and so on and so forth. But so this is an example. And IBS, of course, was important also in the terms of the broader political agenda. It was vocal in questions like the Palestine, very much so. I remember once when the Minister of Palestine, Malki, crossed half of the world to have a breakfast because it was the only opening we had was the breakfast with the IBSA ministers in Brasilia. And IBSA, to a large extent, I don't want to explain that now because it will take long, but to some extent, IBSA was one of the reasons why BRICS was later created. Because China and Russia were very interested in joining BRICS. They never did, but in fact, BRICS became then much more important. And of course, it is because of the importance of China and Russia, of course. But I think, and if I can say something to you, especially from the young lady from South Africa, we should not undervalue IBSA because IBSA is very interesting because the 3 countries have more things in common than maybe with China and Russia, although, of course, China and Russia is very respectful and, of course, very very important for the international relations and for the multipolarity as a whole. And we try to do that in an open way. Just to give again an example, when President Dilma, I was no longer foreign minister then, I was defense minister, and I was not involved in this, but it was very important. When we had a meeting of BRICS in Brazil, we invited the countries of UNASUR, South American countries, so that we also explored these relations with other countries. And there were even speculation whether Argentina might at one point become a member of the BRICS or not. I mean, but these are other things which didn't go out from paper. But anyway, this is the broad political agenda, which in our opinion is part of a vision of the world which is more multipolar. So when we speak about South-South cooperation, the regional integration between regions of the developing world, and I believe we have been pioneers in that in integration with ASPA and then ASA with the Africans. And actually the Europeans, I mean, Periham may know that because later on the Europeans created Mediterranean or something like that. It's called with the Arab world, but it was really South America which first started with the meeting in Brazil, with this meeting of two macro regions of the developing world. So this was very important, in my opinion. It's part of a vision of the world, which of course depends on many things. And nowadays, of course, as I say, Brazil is a kind of stray sheep in the developing world. So we even position ourselves, I'm not saying we, I shouldn't say we, but the Brazilian government positioned itself against a project by India and South Africa, our partners in relation to making even easier to have access to the technology of vaccines and medicine during the pandemic, going beyond what we have in the agreement that I mentioned before. So this is the geopolitics of it. It's not simple. You know, I will say, we know, and Lucia certainly know how much in Latin America we were subject to, Francisco, of course, and also Marina, how much we were subject to lawfare and to coup d'etats that were not of the old style so much, but sometimes even old style, as it happened in Bolivia to some extent, but kind of soft coup d'etats in parliament or injustice and so on. And I tell you, in my opinion, Ron, all this has to do, I mean, I'm simplifying, of course, but I'm speaking about, I'm speaking metaphorically, but all this has to do with the cover of an issue of The Economist magazine in late 2010, in the mid 2010, which showed the American continent upside down. I mean, of course, this is purely prejudice, but anyway, upside down with the south above and the north below. So Tierra del Fuego in the extreme north and Alaska in the extreme, in the top, sorry, not in the north, in the top, and Alaska on the bottom. And that this was the cover of The Economist, of the American edition, at least of the magazine. And the title of this article, which was the main article, was The Rise of Latin America, Nobody's Backyard. Well, I'm sure that when people read that, they say, well, something wrong, and we have to act. And well, the rest is history, so I won't elaborate on that, but I'm just trying to say to you that these things don't happen in a political vacuum. They require a lot of political will. They require a lot of coordination and understanding among developing countries. And that's what we try to do. I could mention one example in the security area, which again, to some extent, was South-South cooperation. To some extent, was the Brazilian-Turkish efforts in relation to the Iranian nuclear program. I'll just leave it to go into the books and look at Tehran Declaration of May 2010. We can see something about that. But anyway, that's another subject. But anyway, this is the geopolitics. On concrete terms, I already mentioned this project in Haiti, but I could mention many others. I'll mention two or three, and then, okay, I just leave up to you. One was the attempt, which didn't succeed completely, but somehow succeeded, even if not as we wished, with Mozambique to establish a factory of antiretroviral medicaments in Mozambique. I heard now that it's becoming a factory for antithermic. Well, it's much less ambitious, of course. But anyway, it's something that Mozambique is producing that it was not producing. Our ambition was much bigger, but that required probably continuation of investment, which did not take place. Anyway, but it's a medical factory in Mozambique, which would never be able to do it alone, and which we did in totally, it was not a private company, it was the government, which was there, and our institutions related to health, especially Fiocruz, that Don Bosco knows, which is very much involved in cooperation, which did that. Another example, which unfortunately was discontinued again, but is to show how difficult it is. So anyway, was when we established how should I say, established an office of our Institution for Agricultural Research, Embrapa, in Ghana. And the first project actually that we developed was in Mali, because this was on the production of cotton. We are very much linked to some of these African countries, which actually are called the cotton four in WTO terms, because they are very much dependent on exports of cotton. I think Burkina Faso, I don't know if Burkina Faso is one of them, but it's very much linked to them anyway, like Benin. So these countries are very much dependent on cotton, and they are very much dependent, and they suffer very much, still suffer, I believe, I don't know now, I've been away for some time, from the subsidies paid by Europe, but above all by the United States. So we got together, coordinated our positions in the WTO. Brazil actually moved the panel, and we won the panel. And part of the receipts, the indemnities that we are receiving for the panel, was channeled for technical cooperation to Africa. So that's very, very interesting and very positive thing, in which this became an automatic resource that we did not even put in the budget, because it was some United States would have to pay Brazil as an indemnity for the damage it was causing to the Brazilian export. And part of it, of course, it was a small part in terms of the total, but still a significant part from the point of view of these poor African countries. And but anyway, apart from that, we had this Embrapa office in Ghana and this project, and I was very proud to go and pick up the first samples of cotton produced with the help of Embrapa in Mali, in a kind of model farm. So these are two examples of very specific, and maybe I can finish, and I think João Bosco has heard that 100 times, so he said, there comes Amorim again with these same sayings, but you have not, I'm sure most of you have not, unless he repeated to you. It's very interesting, and I'll say without any arrogance. I once for a time I was invited when I left the foreign ministry. I was invited, before becoming Minister of Defense, I was invited for a fellowship in Harvard. And one of the persons that I met, the Kennedy School of Government, and one of the persons that I met there was a very distinguished African from Kenya, Kalesto Zuma. He deceased, I think he's deceased now, 2 or 3 years ago. He was actually Secretary General for the Conference on Biodiversity. He's a very distinguished scholar and, in a way, politician. And he asked, he saw that I was there. I actually didn't know him. And he asked to have a meeting with me, and said, and in the middle, in our meeting, he said, because he had lived in Brazil in the 80s, I believe, for 1 year or so in the interior of the state of São Paulo. And he said, I have one thing that I always say: for each African problem, there is a Brazilian solution. Well, if I had said that, certainly my friends, especially Rene from South Africa, would think that I was being arrogant. But that was said by an African, so I feel free to repeat. And I think it's not maybe absolutely true. And in many respects, also, you can say it's the other way around also, because when I think of the teachings of Kofi Annan, how you solve problems by the elder people sitting below a tree, under a tree, and to solve the problem, that would be very helpful for the political situation we're living in Brazil too nowadays. But anyway, so this is how technical cooperation happens. I mean, as I said, it's not a political void. It requires a lot of determination. It requires a lot of political will. It's like affirmative action. It doesn't. The market, affirmative action is necessary because the market doesn't create the possibility. People who speak about meritocracy, they don't know what it is all about. They don't know. I know. I have been at the helm of two important state institutions of government. The foreign ministry. Well, I was a career diplomat, by the way, but I was at the helm of the foreign ministry by almost 10 years, 9.5 years, 8 with Lula, 1 in Camafran. And I was at the helm of defense ministry for 3.5 years. And I could see how discrimination operates. It's not necessarily, sometimes it is, but not necessarily active. It's not necessarily explicit. It's in practice, and also against women. I mean, I had to fight quite a lot to have women promoted as ambassadors. I mean, actually, she just died 2 or 3 days ago. A woman, a lady, was the first time that we had a lady with the level of Undersecretary of State. So it's incredible. It's very hard. And of course, with people of black skin as well, people, African descendants. So we now have some, but it's complicated. I don't want to go into the details of all that, but it requires affirmative action. It's the same thing. South-South cooperation requires affirmative action. It doesn't come naturally because there will always be a British company, an American company, or for that matter nowadays, a Chinese company that will offer something cheaper, something more attractive, better conditions of payment, and we'll be out. We'll be out. So it requires on both sides, and also on the side, for instance, in Brazil, there was not much understanding on that. For instance, when Brazil decided to start having concessional loans, not only for Africa, also applied here to Bolivia or Ecuador and so on, there was a lot of criticism on that. I'm still having a problem with our accounting office because of some of these loans 10 years ago, which were offered with concessional interest rate, which is something that the Europeans have practiced for, I don't know, all along. So, I mean, it requires affirmative action. I mean, to have a meeting, and I tell you, Perihan, and with that I may be really finished. When I was working on the ASPA, the summit between South America and Africa, I went, as I said, several times to Egypt, because Egypt is, of course, first is the headquarters of the Arab League, but it's, of course, also a very influential country in the whole Arab world. I mean, in the middle there between the Maghreb on one side, the Gulf on the other side. I mean, I don't need to say to you, I always said, my good friend Abu Gates used to speak about Cairo as the lighthouse of the Middle East. But anyway, Egypt is a very important country. So I had to convince Egypt. If I would not convince Egypt, I would not convince the Arab world to have this summit. So I went there several times. And there was a Egyptian-Brazilian journalist. I think she lives now in London because she got married with a British journalist. She's Brazilian-Egyptian, both had two nationalities. And she asked me, I remember she was asking me, but why? What for a South America Arab summit? And I tried to explain why I thought it was important and so on. 3 years later, or 2 years later, when we held the summit, the same journalist came to me and said, why not before? Why didn't we do that before? So you see the change, how you have to break with prejudices, how you have to break with ideas that say, well, why Africa? Well, because. Why? Maybe I said I'll finish. Now I'll finish with another thing. But I promise this will be the last thing. When I was in the beginning, this is especially interesting for Lucia, but it applies to the South in general. The question was put about South America, but it applies to the South in general. in the beginning of Lula's government, 2003, I was very much engaged with South American integration. I made, I don't know, maybe 5 trips to Ecuador, to Peru, countries that are not so obvious, not like Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina. Of course, I visited because I tried to convince them. I had to convince them to go along. And then, of course, we had later on the help of the Kirchners, the help of other countries. But anyway, so I had this, and the journalist asked me. I regret it was not alive. It was before our interview. So you have to believe my memory, what I'm telling you by memory. He said, "Why do you give so much importance to South America? Why do you speak so much about South America?" And I said, "Because I live here." No, so that applies to the South. Why give so much importance to the South? Because I live here. I don't live in Paris. I don't live in New York. Or I might live there for some time, but I don't live there. I was not born there. My children are not from there. My grandparents are not from there. So I live in the South. So that's why I give so much importance to South and to South-South cooperation.